of federal law, and we're asking this administration to make a strong statement that this would be the wrong direction for our country, as the President Obama's drug control strategy states that they oppose the legalization of marijuana. We hope that they'll make that more forceful.
Well, let's go back to the phones. Fort Worth, Texas. Ben on our line for Democrats. You're on the Washington Journal.
Yeah, good morning. I think Mr. Hutchinson's on the wrong side of history on this one. I think the damage of penalizing people, putting them in jail over that is worse than the smoking of it. Good luck to St. Pierre. Bye-bye.
Asa Hutchinson.
Well, that's the wonderful thing about our democracy. If the people of America decide that's the direction to go, then you know, we all support that. The DEA would support that. But we're in a debate now as to whether that is the right direction to go, and I would certainly disagree with the caller that you know, we're better off to increase the usage. Even last year, with the mixed signals being given in America, marijuana use went up 1.5 million more users in 2009 versus 2008. And I think this is simply because people are taking a more lax approach to it, so I hope that does not prevail.
Asa Hutchinson, have you seen, with that increase in usage, have you seen any sort of a change, a marked change in the behavior of those 1.9 million people, or a marked change in the behavior of the people in the areas where they live?
Well, I think, of course, those statistics come from the national survey, and there's two national surveys. One is privately run, the other is government run. Both of them have been measuring these statistics for over 3 decades. But in terms of, yes, you have to look at emergency calls, you have to look at treatment statistics, you have to look at driving under the influence statistics, you have to look at productive statistics in workplaces. All of those, I believe, would be impacted by increased usage, and you'd have to look at those statistics.
Let's take this call from Santa Rosa, California. Eric on our line for Republicans. Eric, first, before your question, how do you intend to vote on Proposition 19?
Well, despite that I am not in favor of government regulation, I'll still probably vote yes on it. But I just have a couple points to make, and then I'd like Mr. Hutchinson to respond. First, earlier he called our great nation a democracy, and being that he's in a high government position, he should know that it's a republic, not a democracy. And he and his department, the DEA, should be more careful, because their oath and bond is going to be on the line with everything they do. So the points I wanted to make were that what does Mr. Hutchinson think about the fact that federal jurisdiction exists in something called the federal zone, which is 5 territories. Some of them are not even on the land known as the United States. For instance, one of them is American Samoa. Also, cannabis rebuilds neurons, and that's a research.
I think we've lost Eric. Talk to us about the enforcement in the federal zone there, Mr. Hutchinson.
Well, let me make it clear that I'm a former administrator of the DEA, so I'm in the private sector. I'm not in government now. And Michelle Leonhardt's the acting administrator, doing a great job over at the DEA, of a great agency. So I'm in the private sector now. And in terms of the territories, you know, we have you know, DEA in many of those territories, working locally with law enforcement. So I really didn't get the gist of that question, but I appreciate the caller and reminding us that this is a republic. But, you know, with the propositions we have out there, about as close to pure democracy as you can get, at least when the people are voting directly on one of these legislative proposals.
We do, while we're talking about the legality portion of Proposition 19, we also do want to address some of the economics. There was a report that was recently put out by Jeff Myron at Cato an expert on the budgetary implications of enforcing prohibition of illicit drugs, provided fodder for a long-running debate on the pros and cons of legalizing marijuana, but did little to impress the people to which it was addressed: President George W. Bush, Congress, governors, and state legislatures. One reason: the economy was humming along quite nicely in the first half of 2005. He goes on to say that legalizing all drugs would yield a $41.3 billion a year saving on government spending on law enforcement and a $46.7 billion in tax revenue. Address that for me, Mr. St. Pierre.
The amount of revenue that we're leaving on the table annually is probably between $10 and $15 billion. The amount of windfall that we would take in from police not having to spend all this time going after folks. We have about 80 to 100,000 people incarcerated in the United States for marijuana-only related offenses, and those are certainly folks who are involved in cultivation and trafficking more often than not. And to Jeffrey's point, that it is these crushing recessionary times that has really sharpened these legislators' viewpoints. That's why I mentioned all these states earlier. Not only has the Obama administration given them the latitude and the autonomy to do something different than the federal government's telling them to do, they also see a terrific amount of revenue. And so if we think about alcohol prohibition, that only lasted about 12 years. If it wasn't for this thing we call the Depression today, surely we're living through the Great Recession today, we probably would not have this discussion moving as fast as we are.
Asa Hutchinson.
Well, whenever prohibition ended, did law enforcement go out of business? Did the FBI say, well, we don't have an enforcement responsibility anymore? Of course not. The syndicates, the crime syndicates, moved from alcohol into other venues of crime. The FBI continued its investigative work. Organized crime continued. And today, you know, the argument is that if you're going to legalize marijuana, somehow enforcement efforts are going to decline. And you think about the responsibilities that law enforcement has on methamphetamine, on heroin, on cocaine, the other challenges that they face, those resources are going to continue to be applied. Certainly you can argue, well, maybe it's more effective because they don't have to worry about marijuana anymore. Yes. That's a debate that, I mean, perhaps that's the case. Obviously you're going to have a shift in resources. But you're not going to have those dramatic savings that the Cato Institute cited. Reductions in law enforcement expenses is just not going to happen, and I do not believe you'd have the same benefit on the revenue side either.
Let's go back to the phone. Seattle, Washington. Sam on our line for Independence. You're on the Washington Journal.
Thank you. You're talking to an ex-smuggler. And basically, back when I was smuggling, there were two kinds of smugglers: those that paid the DEA off and those that got around them and didn't. Someone asked John Gotti once how much money the mafia makes from drugs. He says, we're not in the drug business. We can't compete with the government. What you're looking at here in this guy Hutchison is a man that is a fascist. He is a control freak. If I had a can of Drano in front of me and I wanted to snort it, there's no law in the world that could prevent me from doing that. So what I do with my body and my personal usage is my business. And the only reason that we have any drugs illegal at all is so that the government can control us, the government can go ahead and make criminals out of us, and the government can enslave us. So you're looking at this man Hutchison, who is the top, he's a mid-level criminal organizer.
Asa Hutchinson, former administrator of the Drug Enforcement Agency. Your response, sir?
Well, I have extraordinary gratitude for the service of the DEA agents out there. They do great work, and I certainly would challenge the caller's question about bribing DEA. They are tremendous integrity, and you know, obviously when you look at Mexico and some agencies, there are problems, but they're addressed very aggressively, and that's one thing that's great about America. I think we do have a great deal of integrity in our criminal justice system. he certainly makes the point about the libertarian viewpoint that you want government controlling the actions of individuals. And I think we've made a judgment in our society that, on cigarettes, the libertarian view is, government shouldn't be involved. That's a personal choice. But we make requirements on warnings. We educate people on the danger of that. We restrict the use of that in public places. And so I think our society has crossed the line that, we have to balance that. And when society as a whole is tremendously harmed by illegal drug use, then it's certainly appropriate for us as a society to govern those actions.
Brownsville, Texas, you're on the Washington Journal with Asa Hutchinson, of the formerly of the DEA, and Alan St. Pierre, the Executive Director of the National Organization for the Reform of Marijuana Laws. Go ahead.
Well, first of all, I completely think the opposite of what your last caller just stated. I believe Mr. Hutchinson is a very dedicated law enforcement, or at least was a law enforcement agent. And being that I live on the border with Mexico, right in Brownsville, and the war exists all around me. It is a war that we seem to be losing. And I can tell you, I can drive you around. And I can tell you, look, there's a drug dealer, there's his house, and who is not a drug dealer, because I was born and raised here all my life. I see people come from Mexico with nothing, and they start smuggling, and within a year, they are very, very wealthy, and you can spot them. I'm an American. I was born in America, and I can tell you who is legal, who is illegal, who's selling pot, and a lot of times with law enforcement, because they have to have overwhelming evidence, can't just walk in and take them down. Now, I have plenty of family that are in law enforcement. I have a brother that's a Border Patrol agent, and many relatives that have been in the U.S. Customs or police officers, and it is, to my opinion, it is almost an unbeatable enemy, and I think like in any war that is unbeatable, we have to start to come to realize what can we do to make it a draw.
Alan St. Pierre.
Well, like HBO's new series Boardwalk, I think its caller states exactly the ills of prohibition, that destabilizes our borders. There is police and political corruption on both sides of the border. These massive amount of metric tons do not come up from Central and South and Central America into our urban streets without some degree of, minor as it may be, I acknowledge, but there is clearly political and law enforcement corruption that allows this to happen, and he's identified this being so close to the source of it. So my example, I'll use a brand here, and I'm sure the caller can relate to this. Corona beer is made in Mexico. We buy it here in the United States. There is no problem associated with buying Corona beer. If it's taxed and legal, we're not talking about any real legal difficulties here.
Livingston, Tennessee, on our line for Democrats. Wayne, go ahead. Is that Wayne or Waylon?
Waylon.
Waylon, go ahead, Waylon.
Yes, I was just stating that the marijuana industry should be treated as a cash crop. It should be like corn and tobacco, and that way the government can regulate and the people can get what they want. It's just that simple. Everything else is just for other people to make money, evidently. But if you control it as you do corn and tobacco, you should have no problem with it. You have your age limits. You have everything you need regulated already.
Asa Hutchinson.
Well, that's a totally different direction than we're going in our country now. I certainly understand from the previous caller in Brownsville, Texas, the frustration along the border. I note that President Calderon of Mexico made the point that if Proposition 19 in California, which would legalize possession of marijuana, that would be totally against everything we're asking Mexico to do today, which is to reduce the flow of illegal drugs coming into our country. And so it would certainly be inconsistent with the direction that we're going. In terms of taxing and regulating, it's all a question of whether you want another a substance like marijuana from a illegal environment to a regulated environment. If you do that, consumption will increase. And that's the fundamental question. Do the parents of our nation want marijuana use to increase? In Alaska, I believe it was in the 70s, they decriminalized marijuana. And then when consumption went up, they saw the problems and the social problems, and voters once again recriminalized it and said that's not the direction we want to go. So again, we have to learn from those slices of history, and I think that's one of them that show consumption would go up.